The next track on the F123 calendar after Jeddah is Australia, and boy, this is an extremely fun circuit to drive. It's been a staple on the F1 calendar for years now, but it saw a relatively big change to the layout last year. The track itself remains fast with a good number of medium to high speed corners and long straights that make for great overtaking in F123. Now, my previous car setup for Jeddah was without a doubt one of my favourites, with extremely high performance. But this Melbourne car setup makes racing around Australia throughout a full race immensely fun and enjoyable. The removal of the chicane along the back straight made the Australian track much faster, putting much more emphasis on a lower downforce aero setup. Before this chicane was removed, you used to be able to run higher downforce, although in F123, you'll still want the downforce levels to be around the middle ground. I've set the front wing aero to 30 and lowered the rear wing aero to 26, and this is about as high as you'd ever want to run unless it's wet or unless you're going for a time trial setup, which this certainly isn't. If you're towards the back of the pack, you may even want to lower the aero levels 1 or 2 points just to make overtaking a little bit easier. Now, the differential setup around Australia in F123 is pretty tricky. There are many corners that would benefit from higher on-throttle diff settings, although the slower corners really require a low on-throttle diff. Turns 13 and 14 in particular, the last two corners on the track, really test your ability to lay down the power without spinning your rear wheels. To counter this and make it easier to maintain traction, I've opted for an on-throttle diff setup of 53% and an off-throttle setup of 52%. The suspension geometry around Melbourne is pretty standard with a couple of minor adjustments here and there. I've gone for -2.6 degrees on the front camber and -1 on the rear. Then I've opted for a front toe out setup of 0.03 and rear toe in of 0.12. Melbourne is relatively low to average on the amount of punishment your tyres receive, so this style of setup can be more catered towards performance rather than preserving tyre life. The suspension setup itself is on the softer side compared to some others. This will allow you to attack corners with higher curbs, which tend to be quite a lot of the corners around Melbourne. Set your front suspension to 23 and rear suspension to just 3, and then set your anti-roll bars to 6 and 1, and finally set your ride height to 34 and 37. Any lower than this and riding over the curbs around this track will become a little bit dicey. The brake setup is standard at 100% brake pressure and 55% brake bias. When in doubt, just run this setup at most tracks. I have seen some setups running a 50% brake bias like in F122, and this approach can work well for time trial, but in a realistic race scenario, a 50% brake bias almost guarantees a spin during heavier braking zones. Finally, the tyre pressures for our Melbourne setup are pretty individualised. I've tailored each tyre pressure to really try to ensure the tyres wear evenly without affecting performance too much. Set the front right tyre pressure to 22.6 psi and the front left to 22.7, and then set the rear right to just 20.1 psi and the rear left to 20.3. This low tyre pressure approach will ensure you maintain good traction around the slower corners and help rear tyre life. When testing this setup in a longer distance race, I could easily pit later than the AI around me. And that rounds out our Australian car setup for F123. This setup gives you a really stable car with no real inherent weakness. It's fast along the straights and that long back curve, and it's stable through all the corners. Plus tyre wear is great using this setup. If you enjoy this setup as much as I do, hit that like button and let me know in the comments below. Also, make sure you're subscribed to our channel to be notified when I drop new F123 setup videos, which at the moment is every single day. Time to head out on track and test this Melbourne car setup even more, and I will see you on track.